big slab of protein in the middle of a plate surrounded by maybe a few little vegetables. So I tried to explain to her that, plants, number one, are going to be healthier, more nutritious than animal protein. But then I tried to help her understand the environmental implications of eating a burger, and all of the factory farming issues with carbon, with antibiotic resistance, with water, land degradation, and not to mention cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity, which stem from people that have meat-intensive diets. So it was timely and interesting, and it was only till just now that I thought I should have assigned that reading. I hope you all got a chance to read it. It'll be good fodder for our conversation with Micheal. I wanted to shift a little bit. So tonight we're going to focus on systems. Last week we talked about values. Tonight we're going to talk about systems and developing food systems intelligence. And as I mentioned last week, at the heart of systems is really the notion of interdependence, that all things are connected. And what we want to learn how to do is to become systems thinkers and to be able to see the world as a web of connections as opposed to discrete, siloed ideas or topics or subjects. And the reporter who I was talking to, she was very much set in kind of a siloed thinking mode, not a systems thinking mode. And I wanted to just share with you one of my favorite passages from a remarkable person who left us this past week, Thich Nhat Hanh. Some of you might be familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh. He's was a very respected peace activist, a Buddhist monk, a teacher, a writer, and really a great emissary of bringing the notion of interdependence to the world. And he was born in Vietnam, and he was exiled from Vietnam for protesting the Vietnam War. I've got a picture of him here that I'm sharing. He was a colleague and ally of Martin Luther King, whose birthday we just celebrated a week ago. And Martin Luther King had actually nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for a Nobel Prize. But Thich Nhat Hanh wrote this wonderful short piece, which I'm going to share with you, called Interbeing. And it's about a piece of paper, which I am going to read from. But I hope you enjoy this. It's called Interbeing. If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. If you're a poet, you'll see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not here, the sheet of paper cannot be here either. So we can say that the cloud and the paper inter-are. The cloud and the paper inter-are. Interbeing is a word that is not in the dictionary yet, but if we combine the prefix inter with the verb to be, we have a new verb, interbe. Without a cloud and the sheet of paper, inter-are. Now, if we look into this sheet of paper even more deeply, we can see the sunshine in it. If the sunshine is not there, the forest cannot grow. In fact, nothing can grow. Even we cannot grow without sunshine. And so we know that the sunshine is also in this sheet of paper. The paper and the sunshine inter-are. And if we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. And we see the wheat. We now know the logger cannot exist without his daily bread, and therefore the wheat that became his bread is also in this sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in it too. When we look in this way, we can see that without all these things, the sheet of paper cannot exist. So you could substitute any of those metaphors, certainly directly into food. And it's a wonderful way of seeing the world and being in the world. And for me, it always heightens my sense of both personal responsibility for taking care of this interdependent world we live in. And it also heightens my sense of wonder and awe. So I hope you might discover the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh. One of his most beautiful books is called Peace at Every Step. And if you struggle at all with any anxiousness, like many of us do during these times, his words are very soothing and calming and a source of grounding. So I would recommend them. So with that, I'm going to look at Pooja. Is Michael here yet? Not yet. So I'll keep going. Anybody a Thich Nhat Hanh fan? I can't see you, but you can take my slide down now. So tonight we're going to talk about systems, and the learning objective, if you want to get formal, is to develop food systems intelligence. How is one thing connected to another? And I might just take a few minutes while we're waiting for Micheal Pollan to join us. I can't remember if I asked him to join at 6:20 or 6:25, but I'll start to introduce him. Oh, what is the name of that passage again? That passage from Thich Nhat Hanh is called Interbeing. Interbeing. And it's available on the internet, and it appears in a number of his books. He's also got Thich Nhat Hanh has had a really prolific writing life, and he wrote a beautiful little book that I love called How to Eat, that brings mindfulness practice to everything we do with food and a deep appreciation of every bite, and uses eating really as a form of meditation. So if that appeals to you too, you might really enjoy immersing yourself in the work. Also, of course, one of my dear friends sent me a beautiful video of Thich Nhat Hanh on YouTube, which maybe I can find it for you at the break and I'll post it in the chat. And it was him chanting a piece relative to interbeing. So tonight, interbeing, interdependence, food system intelligence, and I'm very happy to welcome Micheal Pollan to our class tonight. Micheal, as a fellow gardener, is certainly someone who sees the world as a interdependent source of connected beings, sentient beings. Good evening, Micheal.
Hey, Will, sorry I'm late,
No
but
problem.
Zoom tripped me up.
I just had a chance to share a little piece about interdependence and interbeing from Thich Nhat Hanh to honor his passing this week. And I was just mentioning that as a fellow gardener, you certainly have developed a sense of how everything is connected. And so that's really the theme of tonight's class, is to develop food systems intelligence. And I'm delighted to introduce this class of nearly 200 students to Micheal Pollan. Many of you have already told me how much Michael's writings have influenced you. Certainly for me, he is a great source of wisdom and inspiration. His books have kind of transformed both my understanding of the food and the food system, everything from the omnivore's dilemma and food rules and cooked and lots of other things. And but probably most potently, I think, was Botany of Desire was my favorite of all your.
Well, as a gardener, that's not surprising.
Right. But one thing that Micheal's a change maker in his own right, and I think his gift is that he knows how to tell a story in a way that you feel like you're right with him on the journey. So we're grateful you're here. And it should be noted that Micheal is really the founding instigator of this course. And it's thanks to him and his initiative and leadership and collaboration with Alice, who we saw last week, that we're all here tonight. So it's a pleasure to have the godfather of edible education.
Thank you, Will. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I have to get over my brief moment of Zoom panic. I also got home 1 minute before I was due to be on. I was hiking in Tilden Park and suddenly looked at the watch and ran.
Thank
So
you.
anyway, great to be here. And, connecting the dots is really what it's all about, both as a writer and as a thinker about food systems. And I sort of see that as what I've done in my work or tried to do in my work, because when I started writing about food, which goes way back to 1999 or something like that, when I wrote about genetically modified crops, when they were still brand new. If you wanted to learn about food, you had the recipe sections in the Wednesday newspapers, and there'd be chef profiles and articles on how to cook. That was food. And if you wanted to know about agriculture, you had to read trade magazines like Beef Today or Progressive Grocer. And the two worlds didn't speak, as if that food that was being cooked and celebrated in the newspaper just came out of the supermarket, which is what most people believe. So I think the first great dot connector, though, was Eric Schlosser in Fast Food Nation. That was a very influential book for me, because he by just starting to look at fast food meals, he looked at the whole system that was producing the fast food meal, that made them as cheap as they were, that made the meat production as brutal as it was. And I learned a lot from that. And Wendell Berry, another key influence, and Marianne Nessel, another person who I think is key. So for me, I think that's what taught me to look at food as a system rather than as a series of discrete parts.
Now, we use the terms food chain or supply chain, and we use the words food system. Is there a distinction there?
No, I like food chain just because it has it's a term that comes out of ecology.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I am always trying to connect what I'm doing back to plants, fungi. I mean, it all starts there in the earth. And food chains all begin in the earth. So you could say supply chain. It's a kind of more colder bureaucratic term. Or you could say food system, which also is a kind of not a beautiful term. I mean, some of it's aesthetics, but food chain, which is what I try to use in my work, is a great reminder that there's a beginning to that chain, and it's always some plant growing in some place.
It's interesting when you Google, say, food chain or supply chain, you'll often get a kind of a linear map that takes you from the soil, take you from how the plant is produced or the food is produced, and then it'll take you through processing and distribution and sale. And just in recent years, those maps have added waste.
Yes.
And but
which should complete a circle.
It should, but what's really interesting is on many of these maps, there's no presence of human beings.
Yeah.
And
well, labor is always an uncomfortable thing for the food industry, so they just kind of leave it out.
And there's often no presence of something you write a lot about, which is the concentration of corporate power, which influences the laws and the subsidies and the financial and economic structures that have so much influence. Um, so maybe we could kind of revisit this. I reread your wonderful article from May 2020, just in the early months of the pandemic as things were kind of starting to fall apart. And I think for the first time, many Americans experienced shortages, primarily of toilet paper, but
Food too, though, meat.
yep.
Yeah, no, there were food shortages. Pasta disappeared from supermarket shelves, tomato sauce,
Sugar.
sugar. That's right,
People
because people
started
were cooking at
hoarding,
home.
yeah, baking stuff. And
It was the first few months of the pandemic were a really good illustration of how brittle the system is and how, it's just in time inventory. It works on this kind of incredibly small margin for error. And that is the product of valuing efficiency above everything. What's the most efficient way we can sell toilet paper or manufacture it? And that has led us down this path, and it has given us cheap food. I mean, Americans spend a very low percentage of their income on food compared to most people who have ever lived. But there's always a cost. A highly efficient system will tend to not be resilient. And resilience and efficiency are really in a seesaw relationship very often. And we saw that. There was no give in this system. So about 50% of American eating is supplied by institutions, schools, factories, restaurants, what's called food service. That's half of the economy. And the other half is, people buying food and cooking it and, at the supermarket. And over time, these two food chains have gotten very specialized. They're different. And so in the food service, they sell milk in like 30-gallon boxes. Suddenly there was no need for those 30-gallon boxes because nobody was eating from institutions anymore. And there was no milk in normal size, half gallons and quarts. And that disappeared from the shelves. But you couldn't move that huge amount of milk that was going to waste into the other supply chain because it was not sold in the right size packages. Those companies didn't have the proper relationships with supermarkets. They were so dedicated to putting milk in those industrial stainless steel containers. That's all they could do. And it was really, it looked really stupid that we were, there was a milk shortage in the supermarket, and yet you turned on the news and they were emptying out tractor trailers of milk onto the soil. They were just throwing it out. And to me, that was just a great illustration of how brittle the system had come. It was brilliant in one way when there was plenty of, give, and everybody was acting the way they usually act. But with the pandemic, the consumer moved. And that's what happened to toilet paper, by the way. That's why there was a toilet paper shortage. There was plenty of toilet paper, but it was being sold on rolls this big, going to factories and offices and schools. And nobody could figure out how to put it on smaller rolls and sell it to back to supermarkets. And eventually they figured it out. But it really showed us that this competition, this specialization, had gotten completely out of control. And it was interesting to see who could pivot. It was the small farms, the diversified farms, who, even the ones who were used to selling to restaurants, they very quickly pivoted to farmers markets and to CSAs, community supported agriculture. But the big players couldn't do that as quickly.
I watched another relatively small company called Revolution Foods, which you know
Mhm.
of, which started in a class at Berkeley, one of my
That's right.
classes about 15 years ago. And Revolution Foods has been very innovative in providing healthier food for schools. But then all of a sudden, when the schools closed because of COVID, pre-vaccine, all of a sudden their business was completely disrupted. But because they were still a modestly smaller company than, say, Cisco or Aramark, they were able to shift to addressing really food insecurity. So all of a sudden, COVID also created a lot of strain on um, in communities
And
and
food
food
banks were
banks.
completely
Right.
overwhelmed.
So they shifted their focus, and was interesting because all of a sudden, and also you'll recall that at the same time, especially here in California, we had these horrendous fires, and so we had the healthcare workers under severe duress. We had firefighters and other, civil servants really under duress. And Revolution Foods started working with mayors and other city officials to provide food to those communities and
Oh,
populations.
that's so interesting. I didn't realize that. That was very clever.
Yeah. Well, when I was looking at your piece this afternoon, I kind of pulled out a little formula because you talked about the value of local systems, like you just did with small farmers, but regionalization plus redundancy equals resilience.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think we need to value resilience a lot more because shocks are what we're going to have. They're going to be the shocks of too much rain, of too little rain, of storms, I mean, there's so many, we just can't count on a reliable environment to grow food in. And so we need to be designing food systems with resilience in mind. And there's a whole body of research, that shows that diversified farms survive weather catastrophes much better than monoculture farms. Monocultures are, I mean, they're the great example of efficiency at the cost of resilience. When you plant in monocultures, it's very efficient. You can grow a lot of food. You can harvest it all at once using, very efficient machinery. And you wouldn't think, well, why do it any other way? Well, when you have shocks to the system, monocultures don't do well. And we saw that the year before last with floods in Iowa. But there have been studies of these diversified farms in Central America where they deal with tornadoes and hurricanes. And the more diversified they are, the more survivable they are too. One crop may be devastated, but there's another that isn't. One crop may be ready to harvest and get, completely destroyed, and there's one still coming up. So, it goes back to the old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. There's real danger when you put all your eggs in one basket, but that's exactly what American agriculture does. It is devoted to monoculture with a kind of fervent, and it's what renders it really vulnerable. Also to pests and to soil exhaustion. And, nature doesn't do monoculture. Only humans do monoculture. Nature does polyculture. And so, and in a way, what we saw was a monoculture of business too. If you're selling all your toilet paper to schools or all your milk to schools, you're also putting all your eggs in one basket.
and it's a great reminder about how we should be eating from a diversity perspective too.
Well, that's what we're getting at when we talk about food systems. If you grow monocultures, you're going to eat in a certain way. And we do. So, most of American agriculture consists of monocultures of either corn or soy. These are the crops that take turns in American fields all through, less so in California, but all through the Midwest in the farming belt. And the reason we grow that, so much of it, is, there are a couple reasons, but one is the government encourages farmers to grow it. There are heavy subsidies for the growing of corn and soy. The reason is, though, that it's at the basis of a certain kind of food chain. And foreign policy in America is dedicated to making food as cheap as it possibly can. And this goes back to something that happened in the 70s when President Nixon was president, and food prices, there was a spike of inflation in food prices. And he went to his Secretary of Agriculture, who was a brilliant agricultural economist named Earl Butz, and said, figure out a way to get the prices down of food. At the time, the government supported a certain floor in the price of corn and soy. I won't go into the details because they're really complicated, but they're in The Omnivore's Dilemma if anybody really wants to look it up. And so the idea was to hold farmers, give them a basic floor so they wouldn't go broke. And he got rid of that floor and basically started cutting checks to farmers, rewarding them by the bushel. The more you can grow, the more subsidy you'll get. And what happened was, and he encouraged them to get bigger, get out, and plant fence row to fence row, stop diversifying, basically. Now, of course, with everybody producing more corn and soy, the price went down, which is exactly what he wanted. And farmers had to industrialize even further to keep up. They could only keep up by increasing yield, since there was no floor on the price. And they did, of course, and they got very efficient. And the input suppliers with the fertilizer and the pesticides also helped them do this. And it's an astonishing achievement how much corn an American farmer can grow. I mean, it's like 300 bushels on an acre of America. I mean, this is a vast amount of food. I don't know if people know how big a bushel is, but it's like 52 pounds of corn, 300 of those on an acre. The problem is, it's not exactly food. The kind of corn that's grown in the Midwest, you could not eat. It's not sweet corn. It's number 2 industrial grade feed corn. And it is a raw material for a system. It's not a food. So what system is it for? Well, mostly to feed animals. This is animal feed. Most of the food we grow, about 40%, we feed to animals to produce meat and milk and eggs. About 10% is fed to your car, believe it or not, because every gas station, 10% of the gas they sell is ethanol made from fermented corn. Why? Because there was so damn much corn, they didn't know how to get rid of it. And they figured out, well, we can feed some of it to the cars. Is that a good idea? It sounds very green, right? It sounds like plant-based fuel for your car. But in fact, it takes so much fuel, so much fossil fuel to produce a gallon of ethanol that it's like a wash or worse. But now it's kind of locked into the system because the farmers depend on it. And then the rest of it turns into things you shouldn't be eating. High fructose corn syrup, for example, junk food of all kinds. All the obscure ingredients on that package of Twinkies are corn or soy-based raw materials. So the way you farm influences the way you eat. And even though it looks like in the supermarket, there's this incredible diversity of food and we have amazing choice. And there are like, 14,000 new food products every year, some crazy number like that. Most of it is really just dressed up corn and soy in one way or another. And so we're actually not getting a diversity of species, which is what you need for your health. Your gut really wants you to eat plants, not derivatives of corn and soy, even though those are plants. So you have to look at the way we farm and the way we eat and our public health and our environment as all of a piece. And most of the problems you can trace to a system that encourages, indeed forces farmers to grow vast amounts of one or two crops. And you could add wheat to that list too.
Mm-hmm. And as Marion Nestle has probably made clearer than anyone else, at the heart of this, and you went back to the Nixon administration, is the politics that drive all of these, that really are focused on the levers. And so out of sort of trying to restore confidence in the political system and in the political leadership, Nixon charged Earl Butz with this task. In your article, you this is early in the pandemic and this is before the election. You have kind of a hopeful, gee, wouldn't it be nice if a politics of appreciating regionalization, localness, the value of resilience. You said it's not hard to imagine that.
Easier to imagine than to affect. Yeah. Well, some good things did happen though. I mean, I still talk to small diversified farmers, and they're doing much better than they were before the pandemic. I was talking to a farmer in the Boston area, and his CSA had gone from 700 members, a big CSA, to 2,100. Mm-hmm. And it fell back a little bit. Some people realize they don't know, they're not comfortable with CSAs, or they don't want to cook quite that much, or they don't know what to do with the kohlrabi or whatever. But he's doing a lot better. And CSAs are doing very well. People are cooking more at home, which is a very healthy trend. So some things have changed, but changing the system is going to be really difficult. I've been working on food system change now since, I don't know, Omnivore's Dilemma came out 2006. And the reason is that a lot of what needs to happen threatens to drive up the cost of food. And cheap food is just, politicians, the French Revolution, was caused by food prices getting high. Like, mm-hmm. Kings lose their heads, when food prices get high. You want food to be as cheap as possible. You don't want it to interfere with politics. We're seeing that right now. We're having this bout of inflation, some of which is food. A lot of it is fuel. People get really restive. And so the challenge is, and there are people who can't afford to spend more on food. We have to remember that too. So that if we're going to change the food system and make it more just and more environmentally sane, we're going to have to make sure at the same time we raise the minimum wage and do what's necessary so people can afford to pay more for food, which is to say, pay the real cost of food. Because right now we're not paying the real cost. When you buy a fast food hamburger, that is a heavily subsidized product. It's subsidized by the taxpayer. It's subsidized by the environment. It's subsidized by the people who work in the slaughterhouses, who are being, terribly exploited. That burger probably, and people have tried to calculate it, it should cost $50 or $60 if you could actually, figure out the real cost. But we don't pay it at the register. We pay it with our health later. So I think the issue of price really complicates food system reform.
Last week, Michael, the assignment was to begin a food diary. We're hoping that students develop a sense of being able to track. Tracking is a key skill set of any change maker, to be able to track and recognize patterns and then become aware of how you might change those patterns or identify leverage points. And I'll never forget, years ago, I was at the Natural Product Show, and they were very thrilled to have you as the keynote. And I think they thought you would come on stage and kind of anoint their tribe as being, in the right, and the good guys and the people with all the natural food. And you got up there, and I remember you picked up a package and you started to try to read the ingredients on a package of some natural food product, and you were squinting, and there were all these unpronounceable words, and you coined one of the best memes, or it wasn't even a haiku at a time. Maybe you could just share that with the students. It's such a guiding principle now for so many.
Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's really all you have to know about diet. It's easier said than done, because eat food, isn't it all food? Well, no, a lot of it's not food. A lot of it we should not dignify with that beautiful word. It should be called edible food-like substances, and the supermarkets are full of edible food-like substances. I remember that. I was a rude guest, but before I spoke, I had walked through the exhibition hall, and this is supposedly the good guys, the Natural Food Expo, and but everything was supplements, being sold as solutions to any health problem imaginable. It was like most of the products, and then the products were highly processed, making like absurd health claims. And one of my food rules is, don't buy any foods that make health claims. The real foods are quiet. The real food is like that bunch of broccoli, which has nothing to say. Why? Well, because it doesn't have a package. Why? Because it's fresh. It's the packaged foods that have the room and the money to get the research done to make bogus health claims.
So,
So in general, it's a bad sign if you see a health claim on a food.
so I want to take you back to my morning. I was telling the class before you joined that I was asked by the university to speak to a reporter this morning who's new to the food beat. And she asked me, what's up with McDonald's selling a plant-based burger, a McPlant burger? Is this the sign that, vegan and vegetarian food is going mainstream? But then she was asking me, like, is this healthier? And so are these McPlant burgers, is this food or is this food like?
I think
Uh,
that's, well, I haven't looked at that one or the
yeah.
ingredient list for that one. I have to go try it. I have been trying the various plant-based burgers, Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger. These are, it's not an easy call. It really depends on your values as an eater. If your values are primarily environmental, there is some advantage to doing anything to shrink the beef industry. I mean, I think you'd be better off with a real veggie burger made from vegetables. But these are highly processed products. They have something like 23 ingredients. One of the ingredients in the Impossible Burger has not been part of the human diet before. This kind of heme iron that they've taught yeast to manufacture and is found in blood normally, and that's what gives it its color and taste and smell. It's very effective. I mean, you could fool me with an Impossible Burger, but it's don't overlook the fact that it's tons of fat. I think it's got a lot of coconut fat in it. It's made from GMO soy, a lot of soy. GMO soy is sprayed with lots of glyphosate, which we're learning is a really dangerous herbicide, and nothing you want in your body. And so, but if your first concern is, say, climate change, as the founders of these companies, that is their first concern. They're not selling health food. The problem is they're implying it's health food, and the reason is that phrase plant-based now has an aura of health. If it's made from plants, it's got to be good for you, and I think that's too bad. Because it's not necessarily true. I mean, there are really good plant-based products of various kinds, but they're not. It's not a guarantee. So as usual, the consumer is in the dark. There's no deception going on, but I think that people don't realize that this is probably not any healthier than beef. I mean, the chances that it has salmonella or something are probably lower, or E. coli much lower, and certainly the beef has been treated with hormones for the most part in America, and this is not treated with hormones. But it's not an easy thing to weigh. Is this better or worse? It finally comes to, as with so much in eating, what do you value? I mean, there's no one way to eat. I mean, if you're eating for your health, that's one thing. If you're eating for the environment, it's another. If you're eating because you object to the treatment of animals, all these things argue for slightly different choices. And there's no one right answer. So, I mean, there was nothing wrong with veggie burgers as far as I'm concerned, but there were people who were only going to eat something that really tasted like beef. And if you can really shrink the meat industry with these products, if you can actually make them cheaper than beef, which they haven't figured out how to do quite yet, and that in itself is incredible, that a soy-based product is still more expensive than a piece of a cow. When you think of how inefficient it is to produce food through this animal, that would not be a bad thing. I
But
think that
let's talk about how that might be possible or inhibited, because as you mentioned in the article, there's like 4 companies in the world that control the meat industry and the meat
the beef
packing
industry,
industry.
yeah.
And now we're seeing that some of those companies have actually either made investments or acquisitions already in the plant-based protein So they're going to be in positions where they can influence or control pricing. Um,
Yes, that's right. And they can keep from being undercut, certainly. That's definitely interesting. Or they could sink these products by making them way too expensive. I mean, it could be like the electric car, you know. I mean, you remember that story way back. This is the first generation of electric cars. GM bought the company and the technology and put it on a shelf. It could be that. You're still dealing with all this concentration. The other problem, though, is that I think really, if you want to bring down the meat industry or shrink it, they have to come up with a really good plant-based steak, because hamburger is basically a byproduct of the steak industry. Nobody ate hamburgers until they started eating steak, and they had to get rid of it, hamburger, and because the damn cow produces so little, steak, it produces all this hamburger. So that's why hamburgers are so cheap. It's a byproduct of steak production. And so if you crash the market for the byproduct, I don't know that you're going to really hurt meat production. The hamburger will just go to dog food or something, probably, as long as there's still a big demand for steak and roast beef and things like that. So there may be a flaw in the business strategy, but you would know more about that than I. So I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think, there's something sad about it. It's basically saying you can't change people's habits. They're going to eat their burgers, so let's change the burger. Let's meet people where they are, versus could we educate people so they ate less meat and realize that if you treat meat as a special occasion food, as it has been for most of human history, and you don't insist on eating 9 ounces of animal per person per day, which is what the average American eats, more than half a pound, it's kind of giving up on the idea you could change that. And I would hope that we can change that we could get to a place where we treat meat the way most cultures do, which is as a flavoring, as a, not this big lump of protoplasm in the middle of the plate, with a few cowering vegetables, that it would just put it in a stew or add a little to your pasta sauce or whatever, the way people used meat for a very long time. But
It's
it's
a beautiful vision, and one that our friend Dan Barber really articulated beautifully in the third plate.
yes.
So
Yeah, there's another way to think about meat. It doesn't involve giving it up. It involves just kind of putting it back in its place. The idea of eating meat, 3 meals a day, as many Americans do, if you throw in the bacon.
with the bacon in the morning, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of an astounding consumption of resources by world historical standards.
Yeah. Let's get the students involved in the conversation now. If you've
Great.
got a question, put your hand up. I see that Joshua and Vivek are standing by. You can turn your camera on. I'll introduce you, and then Pooja or Jackie will highlight you so we can see you. So Joshua, yeah, you're on.
Sure. Hi, Michael. Thanks for
Hi,
coming.
Joshua.
Good to meet you. This last part of the, we kind of got into it a little bit already with the kind of beyond burgers and like plant-based meats and stuff like that. And I was kind of busy typing in the chat that it reminded me in another way of like the electric cars, where, people might think off the top of their head, oh, well, yeah, get an electric car, it might be better for the environment, but then they aren't thinking about really the carbon impact of like manufacturing that car, the lithium mining that has to go into the batteries of that car, which is like obviously toxic. They're not really thinking about, if you're plugging your car in and it's powered off a coal power plant, like how is that, impacting things. Similarly with like the pea proteins, being sourced from like out of country and having to be like shipped in. And like the monoculture agriculture of like soy particularly, that's kind of propping up the movement of plant-based, which like people are seeming to adopt, which is like, seemingly better. I guess I wonder what the carbon and like water use impact would be like side by side.
Yeah, I think I think
Yeah.
Impossible has done some of those life cycle assessments, and it's better than the alternative by, I don't know, 20, 30%. But if you compare it to a real veggie burger, there's
Like
no
your black
comparison.
bean burger or whatever.
Exactly.
Something like that. Yeah.
And by the way, those beans are, building carbon in the soil, or nitrogen in the soil. All these things, I would suggest when you're looking at and trying to evaluate that, go back to the farm. Go back to the farm where it's grown. And what is it? Is it coming out of the soy monoculture, or is it something new? The pea protein is kind of more interesting to me, because if that's scaled up, you'd have some more diversification. You'd have a new legume introduced. Adding to the American rotation of corn and soy and wheat is a really big deal. But Impossible was going to do it with pea protein, and then soy ended up being cheaper. And so they're doing nothing to reform agriculture at that end. And I think that's just as important.
Right, great. Let's move on to Vivek.
Thank you.
Vivek's got a question.
Yeah, hey, Professor. Thanks. It's been a really interesting talk. I was curious about kind of going back to the beginning where you were talking about the kind of two-track food production or packaging system. So I'm taking an antitrust economics class right now. So it kind of tied in, and I was curious in terms of that. How do you weigh the benefits of, let's say, 30 years of, two-track higher efficiency versus the costs of, maybe a once in a century shock to that system? Is there people who have looked at what's the trade-off? And obviously that trade-off maybe is not reflected in government policy now, but, if that analysis is done, then maybe it could be.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So antitrust is I think emerging as a very important issue in the food system. We have allowed for a degree of concentration, of merging, that is even greater than it was in the teens and 20s when we started antitrust enforcement, because we had these what were called trusts, and the reason that Teddy Roosevelt and others went after these trusts wasn't just about consumer prices. It was about concentrations of power, that they were going to distort the political system because they were so big. And not only that, it was the producers, the ranchers who were getting screwed, the chicken farmers who were getting screwed. Because when you have this kind of concentration, if there are only 4 companies buying all the cattle being produced in America, those companies can divvy up the market geographically and dictate prices, which essentially they do. So this is very destructive to producers. And when we started with antitrust enforcement, we were trying to protect producers. Most Americans were farmers at that time, remember. And we were trying to protect the political system from these, ungodly concentrations of political power that were going to distort things. Guess what? That's what's happening right now. We were not focused on prices, on efficiency of prices. And if you look at the Sherman Antitrust Act, the word consumer never appears. So how did our standard for antitrust become, is it good for consumers or not, this merger? Well, that I tell the story in this New York Review of Books piece, which you can get online or on my website for free. During the Reagan administration, the Justice Department started a new policy. This was inspired by Robert Bork, who was a very famous jurist at the time, who was nominated to the Supreme Court and was turned down. But he was a right-wing theorist, and he put forward this idea in a book that then got picked up by the Reagan administration that we will approve any merger unless it threatens to raise prices to consumers. Because some mergers may result in lower prices because of efficiencies. So this cult of efficiency really dates to this memo, which is sitting somewhere in the Justice Department. The law was never changed. The law still gives the government to go after companies if they're screwing producers, not just consumers. The question now is, will the Biden administration rewrite that memo? There's some reason to believe they will. They have a very strong antitrust team. Lena Khan at the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, understands this history really well, and she talks about antitrust in terms of its importance for producers and political power in general. And Tim Wu is also in the administration who totally gets this. So we'll see. I don't have a lot of confidence that when push comes to shove, they will do anything. And that goes back to the Obama administration, which made a lot of promises around breaking up big meat companies and seed companies and others in the food industry. They had a whole initiative right at the beginning. And as soon as they got any pushback, they chickened out and completely folded, which is one of the reasons, by the way, the Democrats have lost the Farm Bill. They made promises they didn't keep to farmers. People, your age probably don't remember, but a Democrat won Iowa twice in the early 2000s. That was Barack Obama. Now that seems so far out of the realm of possibility. So watch the Justice Department and the FTC. I think this is a really critical moment, whether they will take action against concentration in the food industry. And I surely hope they do.
Great. Thank you, Vivek.
Quickly follow up if it's possible.
Well, you know what, Vivek, I'm going to there's a whole bunch of students moving on. So if I can come back to you, we will, but let's let Sydney go now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time and energy being here, Michael. I was curious as this past summer, I did a lot of plant-based financial research for a private equity firm. And there has been a lot of talk and discussion about cellular agriculture. Especially there's been a documentary that was released this past year called Seaspiracy that gives rise to how seafood is unsustainable. So maybe through cellular agriculture, we can have tuna that is born on a petri dish, and we can do the same thing with beef and chicken and eggs, and let's have all meats that way. I'm curious to know, firstly, what your knowledge is on this and how you think this could be applied to a larger scale. There's 330 million and counting Americans. Is it possible to have an idea like cellular agriculture and plant-based foods to make a more carbon friendly future, or is this kind of just a nice idea and a big wave for VCs to ride right now?
It's certainly a big wave for VCs to ride right now. I don't know that much about it. The idea, viscerally, I find a little gross. I know that animal welfare and animal rights people are very supportive of it. I think it's going to be hard to make competitive given the subsidies to real meat. And so that's one issue. But again, go back to the farm. Now, the equivalent of the farm here is there's no free lunch in nature, right? That lab grown tuna or chicken breast has to be fed something to grow. So what is it being fed? That's the question that's the key ecological question. So far, most of the lab grown meats that I know about have been fed bovine, it's the serum from the womb of the cows. Yum. And they say that, well, that's just for now. We're going to come up with another feedstock. Well, what is the feedstock? I think that's really the key ecological question, if you can get your head around eating this stuff. It's the same philosophy, though, as Impossible Burger, which is that people are going to eat their meat. So let's give them something like meat that doesn't have such an environmental, or in this case, animal welfare footprint. The Good Food Institute you should look at in Washington. They work on these kind of issues, and they're very smart about it. It was formed by a former PETA activist, and So they would know what the state of play is. I was offered a tasting at some point, but I didn't. I had to go to Amsterdam to get it, so I didn't do it. But
Yeah.
I'll try it. I'll do anything once.
I had a lab grown steak chip a few years ago.
Steak chip.
That's what they called it, a steak chip.
How was it?
It kind of tasted like cardboard. You know, it was an early attempt.
Dang.
But Sydney, you might want to check out the Plant Futures Symposium this Friday and Saturday if you're not already signed up, because there's going to be a debate on this with, I know Ricardo San Martin, who's a professor in the School of Engineering and knows a lot about this and has a lot of skepticism about the scalability of lab grown. And he's going to be in sort of conversation with one of the CEOs of one of the new well-financed cellular meat companies. So that should be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'll be there. Thank you so much.
Great.
Appreciate the
Let's
insight.
Also, we shouldn't give up on the fact that yes, the way we now fish and the way we now grow food, grow animal protein is really unsustainable, but it can be done sustainably. We just have to shrink our appetite. There are sustainable fisheries. We can probably figure out a sustainable aquaculture. And there's some people that have done this. They've certainly done it with mollusks. So, I wouldn't give up on that idea, that there are ways to grow food that are not even just neutral in terms of the environment, but actually positive, that they leave nature better than we found it. And we shouldn't give up that dream. I think that's a more important dream than the dream of lab-grown shrimp.
I would just add, I find it fascinating how the industry, it's now an industry because it's received so much venture funding, to your point, Sydney, that now they've moved they're trying to move the term from lab grown meat, because that's so unappealing from an aesthetic notion, to cultured meat, which is so interesting because it's so far from food culture as we've known it for thousands of years. But again, it's a little bit about Michael's point about it being kind of loud. It's not quite. It's already advertising itself as something it's not. So.
And cultured implies it's made through fermentation,
right.
Which is thought of as a good health thing. So it's another aura marketing. Also, don't be convinced that because a lot of capital is chasing something, that capital knows what it's doing. Right. Especially when it comes to food. I mean, you'll learn this from Will over the course of the semester. There's a lot of Silicon Valley money that's flowing into food right now, and it's bound to be disappointed because the returns are, not very good compared to, software. Scaling is an issue compared to software. It's just nothing like software.
Whenever you see a food company valued like a software company, there's a bubble.
Run the other way. And we've been through this too. I mean, Silicon Valley money thinks it's smarter than it is. And it is very smart about technology, but like they had a moment of putting all their money into energy in around 2008 or so. They thought, oh, green energy, and we can figure it out because we figured out, phones, and they lost their shirts. I mean, they invested in ethanol, in fact, in a really big way. Which was stupid. And so anyway, it's not necessarily smart money.
One of our favorite colleagues, Robert Reich, Professor Reich, has the term casino economy.
Yeah.
And this really it exudes that. So, well, thank you, Sydney. Let's go to Kate. Kate, question for Professor Pollan.
Hi, Professor. So I wanted to revisit a point that you made earlier, how it's kind of a bad scene to see health claims on food. And I was just wondering what your opinion was on like fruits like blueberries, how they're like high in antioxidants and how that's kind of like a selling point now. If that's like actually the real fact or if it's just like exaggerated for the purpose of marketing. And then just kind of a follow-up question, like, what is your favorite fruit that is actually good for you?
Well, I do like blueberries. A lot. I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's right up there. So all plants have antioxidants. They can't do photosynthesis without antioxidants. So, you don't have to worry. If you eat plants, you're going to get antioxidants. And yes, antioxidants are really good for you. There are a lot of different ones, and they all do slightly different things. So don't just eat blueberries. That has anthocyanins in it. And a lot of purple and blue things have that, and red things, and blue potatoes. But the key is to eat a variety of of things like that. So boasting about antioxidants is like, it's kind of empty. Yes, we need them. They're not hard to find as long as you're in the produce section.
Organic green tea. Don't forget.
Yes, that's another. Yeah, tea has got lots of. So I recently wrote a piece about caffeine for my most recent book, and the most astounding fact I came across in all the research was that the leading source of antioxidants in the American diet. Now, we need antioxidants; they're really essential to our health. The leading source is coffee and tea. Now, that's complement to coffee and tea. But what it really tells you is, wow, we're not eating enough vegetables if that's where we're getting our antioxidants, because they're in everything. So anyway, blueberries are great. And you should know, if you're here in the summer months, that Monterey Market sells blueberries by the pound from a giant tin, a giant case, and you can get all the blueberries you want for a couple months of the year. So highly recommend that.
Well, too, don't they?
What?
They freeze pretty well.
They do freeze well. Yeah. Anyway, we gorge on that for, in like kind of like June, July, I think.
This is the, Edible Ed's secret code here. So don't let it out too broadly.
Yeah. And if you say the words edible education to the cashiers at Monterey Market, they'll look at you like, huh?
All right, Evan. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Michael. I'm a huge fan of your work. And one of the ideas I find myself engaging with a lot is this kind of separation between the value and or cost of goods and the price of goods, as kind of you were talking about earlier. I'm wondering if you can just, riff a little bit more on that. It feels like over the course of my lifetime, in a lot of ways, some of that gap may have begun to shrink. Like, people are starting to appreciate these different types of values and be willing to pay a higher price to justify those. So yeah, I'm wondering if you see positive examples or if you have a positive outlook on that relationship, or could just expand it in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There are cases where the consumer has learned that they can pay more and get something better. Coffee is a great example. When I was your age, coffee was sold for a quarter or 50 cents. It was terrible. It was really bitter. It was all Robusto, there are two kinds of beans, Arabica and Robusto. And it was instant very often, or diner coffee. And Peet's, which of course starts in Berkeley in the 60s, changed the world of coffee. I mean, actually, once Starbucks came is when it really happened, but it was Peet's who came up with this idea of higher quality coffee beans, roasted carefully, and let's get people to pay some multiple of that for what is a fundamentally different experience. And now we all do. And I mean, I shouldn't say we all do, but it's not just elite. It's very common that people expect coffee to be of a certain quality. And that's true with tea too. Before Will got in the business, it was, Tetley. It was like this, this powdered tea-like substance. So it's possible. And I think that that's a really worthy thing for entrepreneurs to do, is to educate consumers about the value of food, what it really costs, and when it's well done. And people have done this with, pastured eggs, for example. I mean, this is kind of a new category that, yes, you're going to have to pay twice or three times as much, but it's a really different experience. And it might look like an egg, but it's not going to taste like an egg. So it's a strategy. I think it's an important strategy, and it's been successful in many parts of the food economy.
We'll bring some entrepreneurs to class later on in the semester who are real artists at that, so we can learn how they think about that engagement, that conversation, both about the price and then also about that true cost of food that Michael mentioned, how much of that dollar is actually getting to the person who's growing the food. So we'll
Yeah,
talk
and you
about
should
that.
talk to Raj Patel when he comes too.
Yeah.
He knows a lot more about economics than I do, and really understands pricing and what the real price of things is.
He'll be
He'll
with
be
us
here
in
in
February.
late February, I think.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Evan. Let's go to Douglas. Let's see if we can, we've got about 9 more minutes with Michael, so let's see if we can get as many questions in as possible. Douglas, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Michael. So I want to take us back to the plant-based burgers conversation and the idea behind consumer behavior change, and just wanted to get your thoughts, based on all the research and all the food history that when you think back to times where diets shifted rapidly or consumption shifted rapidly, which is kind of what we need to get to today. I've always thought of the Impossible Burger as like a band-aid to a better future of just eating less burgers.
Mhm.
What do you think the conditions are to really create that rapid consumption change? And is it strictly based on the economics of making the things that are good for you cheaper and making the other stuff more expensive? Or is it more embedded than that, more cultural?
Yeah, it's, changing people's foods habits is very difficult. I mean, one of the things that I've learned covering this field for a while is that food habits go pretty deep. Marketers have figured out how to do it, certainly. I mean, and that's what I would look at. But they don't do it in any kind of profound way. They're really usually selling novelty. Or what's called brand extension, where you take a familiar product and add to it. But there's a lot of innovation going on in food and a lot of new products getting started. And so people are conservative, yet they're also willing to try new things. I mean, it seems very contradictory. The last time we had major changes in how people eat, was really post-war and the rise of convenience food. It's post 50s. It's my childhood, when we started eating in a very different way. I mean, what gives me hope is that Americans are, and this is a negative in some ways, that we don't have deeply rooted food culture. We're so many different ethnicities and backgrounds that it's not like Italy or France, where you eat the way your parents ate, and they ate the way their parents ate, pretty much. Every generation it changes. I don't eat the way my mother ate, and she doesn't eat the way her parents ate, and so that there is some flexibility there theoretically, if you could convince people. But finally, this is where I think Alice Waters has the right idea. I think we have to start with kids. I mean, that's really where food habits get formed. And that's why I think working on, kids in school, middle school, and getting them to try new foods is so important. Because I think after a certain age, people change their diet when they have a health scare. That's the other thing is fear is a great driver of change. You're too young to remember the mad cow disease crisis, but people stopped eating meat for a while, and or Jack in the Box, some of the food safety crises we've had, that will get people to change. But it's tough. It's really tough. One of the things that I mean, having written about food since the early 2000s, there's been a lot less change than I thought would happen. I thought getting the story out there, getting the information out there, it would happen. But we're really hung up in Washington to a large extent. And that goes back to this idea of, well, first, corporate control of the political system, and we shouldn't minimize that. I mean, it was the industry got Obama to drop his antitrust initiative. But there's a lot of power behind the status quo.
Michael, I want to just go back to that because this year there's a new initiative on campus, which I'm sure you've heard about, called the Berkeley Changemaker. And we are thrilled that edible education has been adopted into the Berkeley Changemaker curriculum. And we're, looking at how does change get made. And I think what you just said is very important to just kind of underline, which was your assumption was, gee, all I need to do is really get the information out there and it'll change people's minds. And of course, changing people's minds is one of your favorite topics, how
Yes.
people change their minds. And I just think that that's a really important thing for um, intellectual beings in a leading university to know, especially
Yes.
about food.
I think that, it's kind of the poignant faith of the journalist. If you get the story out there, everybody will realize the truth and move accordingly. And that's not true. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But we see it politically too. Think of what we've learned about, Trump, and he still, has a shot at becoming president again. So
And the stories have moved, and a lot of the food stories have moved to the visual realm. The rise of Netflix and cooking shows and celebrity chefs
but also all the vegan documentaries.
Right.
They have moved the needle.
Yeah.
Vegan, I think rates of veganism are up. It's still low. Rates of vegetarianism are up. And I think that'll continue to be true. Veganism is not quite the eccentric little ghetto it was just a couple of years ago. But it's the food industry seems more stuck than others. I've been writing about psychedelics in the last couple of years, as people probably know, and I've seen much more change in 4 years around psychedelics. It's people's willingness to entertain the idea, its acceptability in the academy, its acceptability in capital markets. It's astonishing, but not so for food.
Isn't that interesting? And but it's interesting because maybe there isn't such an established concentration of power yet in the psychedelics industry.
Oh, I think you're right. I think that's part of it.
Confining the conversation or confusing the conversation.
Yeah, and big pharma is not touching it so far and not interfering either.
Right.
So I think that that's definitely part of it. It's concentration of power that is really key, and the control of. You have to understand that people have tried to change the Farm Bill. We didn't really talk about it, but this is the piece of legislation that sets the rules of the food game. And there's always a reform version of the bill that's out there, and lo and behold, it gets killed in committee. These committees are controlled by the people who want to be able to buy corn and soy, companies like Coca-Cola or meat companies that want that corn and soy to be as cheap as possible and will step in the way of anything that threatens that.
So what I wanted to come back to just as sort of to connect to systems and how do you change systems really feels that you need to be pressing on multiple pressure points or leverage points at the same time. So just being a journalist or just being an entrepreneur, it's just not enough. And it feels to me like the skill sets for this generation are going to really be about collaboration and coordination of moving culture, moving politics, moving industry, moving personal habits, all in some kind of concerted way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And activism. I don't think we should overlook that. Getting organized. The more I interface with politicians, the more I realize they don't lead, they follow. And demonstrating popular support for ideas, organizing, harassing them, all that really makes a difference because you have to get them to move, and they need to know someone's behind them. Obama famously said to Dan Barber when Dan was pushing him to have a progressive agenda on food, he was like, "Make me do it. Get organized. Get out there and get organized." And he saw that the food movement, such as it is, was not organized, was not politically potent, and so he didn't move. Micheal got involved with food issues, I think, as a way to build up that support, and made some progress in some areas.
We'll
But
have
politicians
Saru.
don't move because it's just a good idea or it's good for us.
And
They
big
have to feel
food is
pressure.
big food's the same way. They just give people what they want.
Yep. And
But
they respond to
Saru
pressure
has-
too. I mean, boycotts,
Yeah.
food boycotts have been very successful driving change. And that's always something. Look at the coalition of Immokalee workers. I hope you'll take that up at
Yeah,
some
we
point.
will. We will. Well,
Um,
Saru Jayaraman.
Oh, great, good.
Weeks,
Well,
so-
there's so political pressure is remains the great mover in American politics.
And Berkeley has a legacy of that, so we need to kind of reactivate that, I think,
Yeah.
in food. So well, Michael, what a pleasure to spend time with you again. I always enjoy our conversations and the students.
Well, me
sorry
too.
that
I just miss being able to do it in person. I'm sorry I was
I know.
scheduled early in the semester. You're going to be live next week?
either next week or in a couple weeks. Just we're going to see with the big auditorium, but we'll be back on campus. If you want to come back at the end of the semester, you're always welcome.
All right, maybe I'll do that. I want to see
Okay.
everybody live and in person.
That would be fun. Thank you
Yeah,
so
have
much.
a great
for being
semester,
here.
everybody.
Okay.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to
Bye-bye.
take a quick break and come back at 7:37. We're going to take attendance then. We're going to have a breakout room and we'll finish off the evening strong. So see you back at 7:37. Thanks. All right, welcome back. What a gift to have Micheal Pollan with us, really one of the seminal thought leaders and writers. I've talked to so many people whose lives changed as a result of reading his book. So I think while we didn't get widespread kind of cultural change, he certainly influenced many people and played a really key role in the last 20 years of changing the conversation around food. So that's really wonderful. We're going to use this next moment to, this is going to be the way we'll take attendance today. So we'd like you to think back to the food diary. You tracked your food intake. Hopefully you learned something about that, looking at it as a composite week and putting it in a journal form. And what we'd like you to do is spend a minute or so writing a sentence or two what surprised you about your food diary. You can put that in chat, and then your answer, we'll use that answer to confirm your